Okay, welcome everyone. So last week was Hanukkah, and we were away. My husband and I were away, but we didn't meet. Teresa, don't worry if you can't hear everything because you can always watch the recording. So I wanted to do something, and actually, as I was preparing, I saw that these two Torah portions tie together nicely, and in a way that I didn't expect. So this class will be the end of Sefer Bereshit, the end of the book of Genesis. And next week we will start the book of Shemot, the book of what is it? Exodus, the book of Exodus. But today we're going to talk about the last two parshiot, which is Vayigash and Vayechi. And so, as usual, what I'm going to do is I'll do a summary, then we'll do a deep dive, and then I'll try to tie them together for you. So, the Parsha of Vayigash is in Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, chapter 44, verse 18, till chapter 47, verse 27. Now, the name of the parsha, Vayigash, means "and he approached," and we find it in the very first verse in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 44, verse 18. And who's approaching who? Yehuda, Judah, is approaching Yosef to plead for the release of Binyamin. So this Bereshit is very narrative. Some of the parshiot, you'll see that as we get deeper in, and you know this from your own reading of the Bible, there's less story and more details or laws or whatever. But in this case, we are continuing in the story of the big confrontation between Yosef and his brothers. So his brother Yosef, Judah, approaches Yosef because he's trying to get Benjamin, the very youngest brother, to be released, and he's offering himself as a slave to this Egyptian ruler who he does not yet know is his brother, in place of Binyamin. Okay. And Yosef is very touched by witnessing the brothers' loyalty to one another, because that, of course, wasn't his story. And he reveals his identity and he says to them, Ani Yosef od Avinu chai. I am Yosef. Is my father still alive? And that's actually, Ani Yosef od Avinu chai is a very famous song. I don't know if it's a children's song, but anyway, as is often true in Jewish music, they take biblical verses and turn it into music in Hebrew. So I am Yosef, is my father still alive? That's the first thing that he says to his brothers, and his brothers are overcome. They are ashamed, they are remorseful, but it is Yosef actually who comforts them, and he says, "You weren't the ones who, I know you think this is because of you. You weren't the ones who sent me here," he says to them, "but it was God. It's all been ordained from above to save us, our family, and the entire region from famine." So right away, we learn from Yosef this incredible lesson in faith in God, in Amuna, that's the first conversation that he has with his brothers. So his brothers rush back to Canaan, to Israel, with the news, and Yaakov comes down to Egypt. We always say that we go up to Israel and we come down to Egypt with all of the sons, all of the tribes, all the families, a total of 70. That's going to be very important. We'll talk about that in a minute. And he's reunited with his beloved son, Yaakov. Jacob is reunited with Yosef after 22 years. And on his way to Egypt, as he's descending, both literally descending physically and also spiritually descending, because Egypt is considered a much lower spiritual level, he gets a promise from God just to tell him not to fear going down to Egypt, because I'm going to take these 70 souls that are all your extended family and go down with you into Egypt, and I will also bring you out again. Okay, so that's like a promise of exile and redemption. And then in the rest of the Parsha, Joseph gathers all of the wealth of Egypt by selling food and seeds during the famine. And also Pharaoh, Paro, gives Yaakov's family a portion of Egypt that is called Goshen, which is a particularly fertile portion, to settle, and the children of Israel prosper in their Egyptian exile. That's the overview of the story. Okay. Now, we talked about these 70 souls, and I want to really focus on one of them, who you're not going to be surprised to hear is a woman, but she's probably either a woman you never heard of excuse me, or a woman that you had no idea her backstory. So her name is, she's known in Hebrew as Serach Bat Asher. Serach is one of the few women that are named in this count of 70 souls that go down to Egypt with Yaakov. And she's actually mentioned by name three times in Tanakh. But the most fascinating parts of her story are not told in Tanakh, and I'm going to tell you them tonight. Okay. So the three places where we find her in Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, in our Parsha, chapter 46, verse 17, and the sons of Asher were Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, and Bria, and Serach, their sister. Okay. And then we find it again in the book of Bamidbar, in the book of Numbers, chapter 26, verse 46. The name of Asher's daughter was Serach. And then in the last place that we see is Divrei Hayamim, which is First Chronicles, chapter 7, verse 30, where it again tells the names of the sons of Asher, Imnah, Ishva, Ishvi, Bria, and then Serach, their sister. So it's sort of a repetition of the verse that's in Genesis. Okay, who is this person and why? Because that is all we know from Tanakh. If all you knew about her was from Tanakh, then you would say, well, she's probably kind of a minor player because all we know about her is that her name appears in this list of 70 souls. So here's her backstory. Serach Bat Asher was actually a stepdaughter to Asher. So Asher, of course, is one of the 12 tribes. And her mother, whose name was Hadorah, which is was married to Malchiel, who was the son of Shem. Okay, so here's the important part. She was a great great granddaughter of Noah. So Noah had a son named Shem. Shem had a son named Elam. Elam had a son named Malchiel, and Malchiel had a daughter named Serach. Okay. Now Asher had a wife before. Her name was Edon. She died, and he married Hadorah, and he adopted Sarah, who at that time was 3 years old. Now, the according to the Midrash, Sarah, even from the age of 3, was very spiritual, and she was very godly and very similar to the house of Jacob in her beliefs, in her actions, and so forth. In other words, she fit right in, even though she was adopted into the family. And God gave her wisdom and common sense. That's what the Midrash says about her. Now, what's interesting is that you remember a few weeks ago we talked about Osnat, who was, just to remind you, she was the daughter of Dinah from when Shem raped Dinah, and she had a daughter named Osnat, and Osnat was sent away. If you remember, she was sent away from Yaakov's house, and she was sent to Egypt, and she eventually becomes the mother of two of the tribes. She marries Yosef and so forth. But the point is that just when she leaves, she's sent away. Osnat is sent away. Another daughter is brought in. That other daughter is Serach. Okay, so according to the Ramban, Serach was I'm going to read you the quote and tell you why it's significant. A daughter who possessed an inheritance, a portion of land in Israel, and therefore scripture mentions her, as I mentioned, just as it mentions the daughters of Tzalafchad, which we haven't talked about, but that comes later in the book of Numbers. Had she been the daughter of Asher himself, she would not have inherited a portion in the land, since Asher had male children, but she was the daughter of his wife from another man who did not have a son. Therefore, his inheritance passed to his daughter. What does all that mean? What the laws were then is that if you were a son, you inherited a portion of the land of Israel according to where your family's tribe was and so forth. But if a family had no sons, then that land was inherited by the daughters. That's a law that becomes obvious later in the book of Numbers with the story of the daughter of Zelophehad, which we're not going to get into now. But the idea is this is the proof that we have that Sarah was her father had no male children. She was not a biological child of Asher, even though she came into the family when she was very, very young. Okay. Um, she was a musically gifted child. And now I have to show you this little children's book. Oops. It's called Serach's Song. I don't even know if it's in print anymore. But when I used, can you see it? when I used to teach, it's a children's book, so it's like a little tiny story, but it has a picture of her on the cover with a harp. When I used to teach in in university in Baltimore, I had a huge collection of books about women in Judaism, and I saved this one because it's one of my favorites. But it's a children's book that tells basically this story. Okay, so she is musically gifted, as I said, and she was known for going around the tents of her uncles and cousins playing music and singing. So the way that people lived in that time is that the family unit lived, everybody had their own tent, but all the tents were sort of grouped together. So so the family unit had some land and it was sort of semi-communal, but also people had some privacy of their own. They had their own tent to go into. Anyway, when her stepfather Asher, and the brothers come back from visiting Egypt and discovering that Yosef is still alive, they need to tell Yaakov. But at this point, Yaakov is already an old man, and they don't want to just spring it on him and risk that he is, God forbid, going to have a heart attack or something and die. And so they come up with this plan. Asher calls over Serach and he asks her a favor. He asks her to sing a little song about how her uncle Yosef is still alive and he's a ruler in Egypt. And so she does that. She makes up a little song, and that's why she's portrayed in this book as being with I don't know if it's called a harp, it's some kind of biblical instrument. But anyway, that she makes up a song. My uncle Yosef is still alive, and he's a ruler in Egypt. And Yaakov overhears her because remember that they live in sort of this encampment, and he overhears her song. And when he realizes the truth of what he says, he gives her a blessing. And what is the blessing? The blessing that he gives her is that she should live forever. And in fact, there's a tradition that she is one of the 9 people that have been said to have been brought to Gan Eden alive, to never have died. Okay. One of the other people with whom you may be familiar that is said is Eliyahu Navi, Elijah the prophet. Okay. So there's something supernatural already. She's a young girl. She brings this amazing news to Yaakov, and she is rewarded with long life. Now, how long did she live? So here's some more stories about her life. When Moshe comes on the scene as a potential redeemer, she's still alive. Okay. So the slavery in Egypt lasted 210 years. I know that the you may think that it was 400 years. In actuality, it was 210, plus the time from when she went to Egypt. Like things weren't bad for the family and for the nation right away. It wasn't until Yaakov dies and Yosef dies and all the brothers die that the slavery part of the story really begins. So let's say 250 years. So Moshe comes onto the scene 250 years later. She's still alive and she's able to assure the Israelites, the slaves, that he's the real true redeemer. How does she do this? Because her grandfather Yaakov taught her a trick, not a trick, a secret. Taught her a secret that when the redeemer comes and he says a certain phrase, that he's the true redeemer. That phrase is pakod pakadati, he shall surely redeem. And Serach bat Asher held that secret for 250 years until Moshe came to free the Israelite slaves. So what does that mean? She comes into Egypt with this group of 70 souls. She lives through the sort of the good years when the family is treated with respect in Egypt. And then she watches slavery happen. She lives through the entire period of 210 years of slavery. She lives to see Moses come onto the scene and to assure everybody that he is the true redeemer. Now, and she's still alive. Now it's time to leave Mitzrayim. So she's already 250, let's say 255 years old. It's time to leave Mitzrayim. It's time to leave Egypt. But if you remember, um, Yosef asked for a promise that they wouldn't leave Egypt without taking his body or his bones along. Okay. But the Egyptians, who did not want that to ever happen, buried Yosef's bones in the Nile River. Okay. Now, because she was alive at the time that Yosef died 110, she remembered where he was buried, where they dropped the coffin, and she was able to take Moshe to the exact spot where he would be able to raise up the bones of Yosef. Now, how did he do that? There's a tradition that there was a coin and he threw it into the river and he said uh, these words that mean arise ox. Yosef is associated with the ox, and his coffin just came floating up. That's how it's understood. Um, and that was all facilitated by Serach Bar Asher. It wouldn't have been possible for them to leave Egypt, and they never would have found this grave because it wasn't a grave. It was a um, I mean, it was a coffin in the bottom of the Nile River. They never would have found it without her help. But I'm not done. Okay, so now fast forward to the time of King David, okay? And Serach Bar Asher is still alive. We're talking 600 years later. This is in the book Shmuel Bet, 2 Samuel, chapter 20, verse 19. She's not referred to here by name. Um, she's referred to as a wise woman, but the rabbis say this is Sarah. So what's the story? She lives in a city that's under siege by um, King David's general, whose name is Yoav. Why? Because there's an enemy living in or hiding in this city. And Yoav wants to just annihilate the city to capture the enemy. Sort of like, let's just bomb Gaza and flatten the whole thing, something like that. But Serach realized this is going to be a terrible disaster because all these innocent people are going to die. And besides which, Yoav hasn't done step one, which is giving the city a chance to surrender peacefully. So she says to Yoav that his proposed action violates Torah law. And they agree between them that Yoav's not going to take the city if it turns over this enemy, like by their own volition. Okay. Now she has to convince the citizens of her town who become loyal to this enemy of King David. She has to convince them to turn over the enemy that they've been protecting, or else the entire city is going to lose their lives. And so now she's 600 years old. Or I don't know, she's very old and she's been around the block a few times, and she convinces the citizens not to go to war against Yoav and King David, but rather to turn over the enemy and save the lives of everyone else in the city. She needs diplomacy and courage and also a solid understanding of Jewish law. And in that way, she resolves the standoff and she saves the town. Now, you can read about that episode if it's not familiar to you in Shmuel Bet in 2 Samuel chapter 20. Okay. Now, she also appears 1,500 years later in the time of the Talmud. And the story goes like this, that there was a rabbi named Rabbi Yochanan, and he was describing what happened when the freed slaves crossed over the sea, when the sea split, and what the water was like at the splitting of the sea. And he told his students it was like a wooden lattice. Now, you may think of the sea splitting in the way that the movie The Exodus shows it, like there's the sea and then it just splits in half and everybody walks down the middle. In fact, according to Torah, there were 12 channels, one for each tribe, and each tribe went individually in their slot across the sea. And so he understands that between each of the tribes, the sides were like a lattice. And she is recorded in the Gemara, it, um, in the Midrash as peeking out from Gan Eden, and she says she was there and the waters were clear like lit up windows. The idea of it, I just find this so amusing. The idea of it is that she's trying to assure or reassure the students that everybody in each tribe, they were very clearly able to see the other tribes, that they didn't have to worry, we're getting through and we can see the way through is clear for us, but we want to make sure that our brothers and our cousins and our sisters and so forth, that they're able to see. So Serach's story is a perfect example of the value of oral Torah, because it's maybe interesting that her name appears 3 times in Tanakh, but that's since I started out by saying that's all we know about her. we would think, well, she can't be very important because nothing is said in Tanakh itself except that she's part of the family of Asher. But the rabbis have preserved so many stories about her life and the many ways that she saved her people, starting from when she was a young girl and ending up when she is already in Gan Eden and she's already peeking back into this world. So that is the basic story of Serach, who we meet for the first time in this parsha. Okay, let's go on to Vayechi. Vayechi is the last parsha, the last Torah portion of the book of Genesis, and we find it following immediately Vayigash, which is chapter 47, verse 28, all the way to the end of Bereshit, chapter 50, verse 26. And the name of the parsha Vayechi means "and he lived," and that the word is found in the first verse, chapter 47 verse 28. Okay, so for 17 years after the 70 souls descend, they're living in relative comfort in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. And before he dies, Yaakov asks his favorite son Yosef, who's still a very important guy, to take an oath to bury him in the Holy Land. And he doesn't want to just be buried anywhere. He wants to be buried in Hebron, in Marat HaMachpelah, in the cave of the matriarchs and patriarchs, which is probably from my house a 25-minute drive. And he blesses the two sons of Yosef, Menashe and Ephraim, and he elevates them to the status of his own sons. And so they become this whole counting of the tribes thing gets a little complicated because Menashe and Ephraim are basically lifted up to the status of being full tribes themselves. When we talk about the tribes, Menashe and Ephraim become full tribes. Now, Yaakov is the patriarch of what is now this enormous family, and he wants to, before he dies, he wants to reveal to them what he knows. He's also a prophet, and he wants to reveal to them the whole story of the end of days, what's going to happen, and so forth. But he's prevented from doing so in an open way. And the tradition is that he wove hints about the end of days into the words that he said to his sons, but we don't have, or I don't have, the tools to explain it to you. Okay. So if you can picture, Yaakov's on his deathbed, his sons are around him, and the tradition is that he blesses his sons and assigns each of them to their role as a tribe. So, for example, he says, Yehuda, the tribe of Judah, will produce leaders, legislators, and kings. And we know that that's true today, that Mashiach comes from the tribe of Yehuda, and David came from the tribe of Yehuda, and kingship comes from the tribe of Yehuda, and so forth. The priests are going to come from Levi. The scholars are going to come from Yisachar. The seafarers, the seafaring merchants are going to come from Zvulun. School teachers from Shimon, soldiers from Gad, judges from Dan. Interestingly enough, Din, it all means judgment. Olive growers from Asher, and so on. And then he um, rebukes some of his sons. He rebukes Ruvain for what that whole thing that happened after Leah died and Ruvain moved Yaakov's bed into um, his his mother's bed, his mother's tent, and so forth. And he also rebuked Shimon and Levi for the massacre of Shechem and the plot against Yosef that they were part of. Naphtali is known to be swift as a deer, and Benjamin, the youngest child, is ferocious like a wolf. And so anyway, he's telling all of his sons sort of who are they. Now, when we think of a blessing, especially a blessing from a dying parent, we may think of the I bless you with this good thing, I bless you with that good thing, and so forth. So I just want to tell you the story. The very first time that I was in Israel, it was in 1996. And my husband and I each spent a day studying Torah. I went to a women's program, and he went to a yeshiva. The first time in Israel, so the place I went to is called Sha'arim. It still exists. It's in Har Nof, and it has a lot of women's programs are for women right out of high school, like young, very young women. But Shari attracts older students, and I was older. I was in my late 30s at the time. And so that's where I went and I spent the day and it was like it was this week 28 years ago. And one of the things I remember the teacher saying is she was talking about the language of the blessings. And if you look over it in this week's parsha, which is this week's parsha, you'll see that they're not traditional blessings. But she said it is a tremendous blessing to know who you are and what your purpose in life is. And that's what Yaakov gave his sons, that he saw in them what they were meant for. Can you imagine if we came into the world and we had, along with our birth certificate or whatever, we had a note card that said, Vicky, this is what you are meant to do in this world. This is your job. And you would know that and you would have that, you'd know your nature. You'd be told in advance. You wouldn't have to flop around in your teens and young adulthood trying to figure it all out. Anyway, um, so that was when we say the blessing, that's what the blessing was. It's how I understand it. It's not traditional language of blessing, but it is this is who you are and this is your role in life, my sons. Okay. Now, so Yaakov dies. There's a large funeral procession. All of Yaakov's descendants, which started out as 70, 17 years ago, now there's many, many more. All of the ministers of Paro, the leading citizens of Egypt, the Egyptian cavalry, they all accompany Yaakov on his final journey back to Israel, back to the Holy Land, where he's buried in the Machpelah cave in Hebron. Now, if you just, I don't know if you can, but if you can picture a map, it's not a short journey. Now, Hebron is in, not the southernmost tip of Israel, but it's south of Jerusalem. But it was still a big deal. The point I think that you're supposed to get from this is that the family is still held in tremendous esteem at this point in the story. Okay. And then the next major lily pad, the next major thing that happens is that Yosef also dies in Egypt. He's 110. And as we already talked about, because you know that Sarah helped them find it, he instructs his brothers that his bones are to be taken out of Egypt and buried in the Holy Land. But that's going to come to pass only hundreds of years later when the Israelites leave Egypt. Before his passing, Yosef conveys to, we'll call them at this point the children of Israel, the message from which he hopes that they will draw hope and faith because he knows in some way that there's going to be difficult years coming. And he says to them, God will surely remember you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay. So that's the basic story. The bad stuff hasn't started yet. That's going to start next week. But I want to talk about this request that Yaakov gives and that Yosef follows with to bury him in Israel in the cave of Machpelah. Why is this an issue? Because Jacob feels like he has to justify his request. Why? Because if you know the story, you know that Jacob did not bury Yosef's beloved mother in this family burial plot. And so if you look in Bereshit in Genesis chapter 48, verse 7, he says, As for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died to me in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still a stretch of land to come to Ephrat, which is where I live, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrat, which is Bethlehem. Okay, so the physical distance between where Rachel is buried and where the cave of Machpelah is in Hebron, I would say by car today is less than a half an hour. Okay. And Yaakov didn't even bring the body of Rachel to Bethlehem, to the city of Bethlehem, which was an established city at that time. He buried her on the side of the road in a seemingly undignified place, instead of taking her to the family burial plot in Hebron or even to the established city um, of Bethlehem. Now, I want to have to tell you this. On that same trip, the very first time I was here, we were on a bus tour, and the bus stopped, And the bus driver told us to get out, and he said, right here is the spot where Rachel was, where she died. Now, I don't know if it was or if it wasn't that exact spot, because there's today, for those of you that have been to Israel or you have seen pictures of it, there is something that we call Kever Rachel, which is the grave of Rachel. And it used to be a very simple building off of sort of this back road. It is now, because Bethlehem has become an Arab city, that it has walls that are enormous, it looks like an army base, that very well defended, very well protected. You have to go through a checkpoint to get into there, and there's a whole building that there's a yeshiva that meets there and so forth. But the cave of Rachel, Kever Rachel, we call it, is a very, very, very popular place, maybe only second to the Kotel, to the Western Wall, as a place that people go in Israel to pray, and it's very close to where we live. Okay. Um, Now, so let's talk about a simple reason and a complex reason for why Yaakov buried Rachel on the side of the road in this um, un not an unmarked grave, but not in a dignified place. Okay. So there's one opinion that he was trying to avoid a transgression. You know that we are talking about the period of time before the Torah is given, but that the patriarchs and the matriarchs did their best to keep the Torah as best that they could. However, you understand that even though they didn't have the text, and there is a law in the Torah that a man cannot marry two sisters. Now, there's a distinction to be made between keeping the law outside of Israel and keeping the law in Israel. Even until today, excuse me, if you're Jewish, the tradition is, with the way that it's taught, is that when you do mitzvot, when you do biblical commandments outside of the land of Israel, it is only for practice. They only count, whatever that means, when you're doing them in the land of Israel. So the Jewish people that keep biblical commandments outside of the land, according to this opinion, are only doing it in order that they don't forget that when they get back to the land, how you're supposed to behave. So there's a big distinction even today between mitzvot, biblical commandments done in the Holy Land and outside the Holy Land. So when Yaakov marries the sisters, he's living with Lavan outside of Israel. But now they're returning to the Holy Land, and the the standards are higher. Okay. So that's um, one of the simple reasons, but there's a much deeper reason, and that is that God commanded Yaakov to bury her by the roadside so that she could spiritually assist her descendants in the future when they would be taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar after the destruction of the first temple. So we're talking way, way after her death. This is after the first temple period. Okay, the Babylonians come in, they destroy the first temple, they exile all the Jews, and they take them all to Babylon, to Bavel. And the path led them past where Rachel was buried. So according to tradition, as they pass her grave, however you understand this, she would come out of her grave crying and begging God to have mercy on his children. And thus we turn to a very, very famous passage in the book of Yirmiyahu, in the book of Jeremiah. If you want to look it up, it's chapter 31, verses 14 through 16. Okay. And here's how it goes. So says the Lord. Excuse me. A voice is heard on high, lamentation, bitter weeping, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children, for they are not comforted. So says the Lord. Now, this is a promise. Refrain your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is reward for your work, says the Lord. And they shall come back from the land of their enemy, and there is hope for your future, says the Lord, and the children shall return to their own border. Okay, so here's the scenario. Throngs of people are leaving Israel because they are exiled and they're on their way to Babylon. They pass by the grave of Rachel. She gets up from her grave. She cries and weeps and begs God for mercy on behalf of them. And according to the prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, he says, don't worry, I'm going to take care of them. In the future, the children will return to their borders. So this phrase, the children shall return to their own border, is in Hebrew, Vishavu banim ligvulam. Now I want to tell you this very cool thing. Um, when um, somebody makes aliyah, when a Jew makes aliyah, very often in this, I saw this happen it happened for us. It happens many times. The very first Friday night, the very first Shabbat that you are a new resident of Israel as an immigrant, they sing this song in shul and there's circle dancing. And what are we singing? Vishavu banim ligvulam, the children shall return to their own border, because in fact, this family or this person or this couple or whatever, they just did that. They just came back to their borders. It's an extremely uplifting moment in Jewish life in Israel, and it comes directly from this verse in Yirmiyahu from Jeremiah. Okay, so after her death, Rachel is known for being a powerful champion of the Jewish people, and we refer to her in Hebrew as Rachel Imenu, Rachel our mother. Interestingly enough, the main road coming into my neighborhood here in Efrat is called Rachel Imenu. That's the name of the street. And it literally means Rachel, our mother Rachel. Okay. And part of that is tied to her selflessness in bringing Leah, her sister, into this marriage with Yaakov. So because of her, Leah had six of the 12 tribes. And also because of her, you remember the story that when she was barren, she brought Bilhah, her handmaiden, her maidservant, whatever you call it, to also into her marriage. And Bilhah had two children, and she had two children. She, Rachel herself, had two. So of the 12 tribes, 10 of them are directly connected to Rachel's actions. Now, there's a very well-known midrash about her selflessness and how it helped her people way after her death. Okay, so we talked a little bit about Yirmiyahu. He's a prophet during the time of the destruction of the first temple, and at that time, a lot of the Jewish people had begun to worship idols. They even brought one idol into the Beit HaMikdash, into the first temple. And Yirmiyahu understands this is not going to play well with God, and that God is like, what is he going to do? So God is about to destroy the temple and send his children into exile. And Yirmiyahu himself tries to intercede in heaven on their behalf. He's pleading with God in the merit of who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. But there's no response. God is not moved by this plea. This is an unprecedented situation because even the prayers of the patriarchs are not answered. That's how dire the situation is. And then, according to this tradition, Rachel comes forward and she prays and she talks to God and she says, in sort of this candid conversation, she says, God, do you know what I, a human of flesh and blood, did? I suppressed my own desire and sacrificed for the sake of my sister. And she tells God the story that my husband Yaakov worked for 7 years for me. And when it came to the wedding night and my father substituted my sister Leah, I didn't want her to be embarrassed. And so I shared with her the secret signs that I had made up with my husband to be. And I did that for her as a kindness. And I wasn't jealous of her and I didn't expose her to shame. And I'm just a creature of flesh and blood. I was made from dust and ashes. And I was not envious of my rival. And I didn't expose her to shame and embarrassment and so forth. So she says, why should you, God, a king who lives eternally, who is merciful, why should you be jealous of an idol in which there's no reality? The idol has no real power, and exile the children of Israel over this and let them be slain by the sword and have their enemies do all kinds of terrible things to them. And this is an argument that God accepts. So he doesn't accept the argument of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He accepts the argument of Rachel that, just to put it in a nutshell, she says, look, you are angry about this idol because it seems to be taking your place. I let my own sister take my place. And if I did it, you can do it too. Okay. And so God is stirred and he says, for your sake, Rachel, I will restore Israel to his place. So it didn't cancel the exile. I want to be clear about that. The exile still happened. We still went to Babylon for 70 years before the rebuilding of a second temple, but it did lead the Jews to be able to return after those 70 years. And the promise still stands again in the Messianic era. So just to look just a little bit deeper, this quality that activated God's mercy, what was it that successfully made him promise to return the Jews to their homeland? Think of how angry he was and how Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, the prophet, for a very long time was warning people to get it together, to do the right thing, to worship God, to be on a godly path, to stop playing around with this nonsense with idols and idol worship and so forth. And they didn't listen to him and they didn't listen to God. And so God is rightfully, um, I'm going to say angry, even though I don't know how we understand God having human motion, but the truth is that the tradition is that God did not he took out his anger on the building. He destroyed the first temple, the physical building, instead of destroying the people. So he sent the people into exile. But we obviously, because I'm sitting here today living in the land of Israel as a Jew, we obviously survived as a people. Even though we don't have the temple, we don't have the first temple, we don't have the second temple, but we have a promise for the third temple. But the core of this was Rachel's ability to sacrifice. So, what is sacrifice? Sacrifice is when you relinquish something that's precious to you rather than hold on to it. Um, that sacrifice is can be something that no one knows about. Or if they do, it isn't necessarily celebrated. A sacrifice that you make for God can be a very quiet kind of thing, and it can be very hard. Um, so so some of you, I know from because of the stories that I know, that some of you have sacrificed some of your family relationships, some of your communal relationships, some of your colleagues, whatever, that you have sacrificed in order to follow God. Okay. But for God, it's a very precious key to open the door of his heart, however you understand that. So, what did she sacrifice? She sacrificed not only in her lifetime being the only or the spouse, the most important spouse of Yaakov, she also sacrificed the merit of being buried near him for the sake of her future children. So, because remember the story that I told you that after the temple is destroyed, it is Rachel who asks God for mercy for them. Okay, it's um, that quality of sacrifice, what we call in Hebrew Mesirut Nefesh, which is usually translated as self-sacrifice, but it's like from your kishkas, like from your soul. It's not just you have an ice cream cone and your kid wants it, so you give it to your kid. It's not like that level of sacrifice. And that's the quality that ensured that her prayer would be accepted. So thanks to her sacrifice, God responds with mercy, and we're still waiting for the ultimate return of the Jewish people. That now most of us can't imagine her level of self-sacrifice. From the first meeting, she knew that she was destined to be the wife of Yaakov, and she gave over the secret signs to her sister on the day that was supposed to be her wedding day. And she even brought her handmaiden Bilhah to her husband. So just to remind you of this piece of the story, I think I didn't say this yet, that Bilhah was her handmaiden, and Rachel had no children. And did I say this part already about her being a sir? I'm not sure I've said this. That the idea was that Bilhah would get impregnated from Yaakov, and the child that she would have would be a child that Rachel herself could raise. That's the way things worked back then. It sounds a little distasteful to us now, but she even brought her handmaiden Bilhah to her husband, so she sacrificed there as well. Okay, so with this, I'll finish. We have this deeper look into these two women, Serach bat Asher and Rachel Imenu, and through their righteousness, they impacted the nation of Israel to this day. Okay, but their stories are told not fully. The stories that I've shared with you tonight are not fully told in Tanakh. They are told in the rabbinic tradition. Okay. So that is our lesson for today. And now I invite you, if you have questions or you want to unmute yourself, I'm happy to hear anything that any of you have to say. Nobody? Yes, Natalie. Natalie first and then Valerie. You have to unmute yourself so we could hear you. There we go. Well, nope. You're still muted. Can't hear you.
Okay.
There you go.
I wanted, it's a bit different, but I wanted to know because I've learned that when Jacob, oh no, I've learned two things, two beautiful things. Then when Jacob it was planned that he was coming into Egypt, but God in his mercy brought his son Joseph first. So Jacob won't arrive in Egypt as a slave. And I thought, wow, this is a beautiful story. How God changed. Do you understand how He
I do.
planned this?
I want to say something about that. The very first time that I was asked to say something on the Parsha, it was at a women's prayer service. We're going back 35, 40 years, I don't remember. And I hadn't been religious for very long. And it relates to what you just said. It's a little twist on it. And I was asked to speak about the Torah portion of Vayigash. And, or maybe it was me, Kate's. Eh, Did I tell you the story already? I can't remember. Anyway, I remember that the story, what I said was, because I looked at whatever I could access. I said, oh, here's an interesting thing. Look at how God works so far in advance. I told you that in the beginning of Vayigash, the way that Yosef takes care of everybody is he sells he sells grain and he sells seeds, right? And in exchange for all of the riches of all the neighboring people, all the neighboring countries. So all of those riches come into Egypt. So that when the Jews, well, they're not Jews yet, but when the Israelite slaves are redeemed after 210 years of slavery, they leave with great wealth. How did that wealth get there? It got there of because Yosef was sent, and that's why when Yosef says to his brothers, God sent me here, it's almost like he could see the whole thing playing out, that he was there to prepare the way for his family. And I'm sure he knew because he promised that it would end, they would get out of Egypt at some point. But also, all of the wealth of all of the surrounding nations ended up in Egypt so that the Israelites could be compensated as they were leaving. So it's very similar to look at it like from that perspective. That's the
Mhm.
very first Torah message that I ever gave over. So thank you for reminding me of that.
I know.
It,
Ah, sorry, it's my dog. And
you,
there was something else. It's about. I'm sorry. Wait, maybe I put him outside. Wait.
all right, well, let's go to Valerie while you're doing that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Valerie, can you unmute?
Yeah. The I appreciate the story about the people coming home from the captivity. The midrash that I was familiar with before that one you didn't mention, but um which was also very cool that when Joseph was being actually taken into captivity into Egypt, on his way there, they went through Bethlehem, and he actually fell on his mother's grave and was weeping, and everybody was making fun of him because he was so upset because and he was laying on his mother's grave, but uh, she actually spoke to him and which is kind of like he didn't inquire. I mean, he was shocked. He didn't really, I mean, like he wasn't asking her to speak to him, but she spoke to him and told him the things that are recorded actually in the prophets that you quoted today. And like she was weeping for him. It says like she was weeping for him but she actually told him that it was actually God's will that he be going down to Egypt, and that he was going to bring the family home and a great deliverance, and like all that stuff, which is probably why he was able to tell his brothers when they he revealed himself to them that it wasn't your plan, it was God's plan all along. Like Joseph knew all along, he had that hope, according to the midrash,
Well, or
that
a promise. He had a
yes, it was
promise.
promised that it was going to happen, and that there was a real reason why he was actually there in the first place, and that it was actually Rachel who revealed that information to him. And almost the same, like it was almost like that the Ezekiel or Jeremiah, whoever you quoted, Jeremiah was
Jeremiah.
actually quoting what they already had as a midrash for when Joseph was actually going down to Egypt himself in captivity in the other direction. So like it's pretty cool that anybody coming home would pass by there, right? So
It's what is one of the things that's so fascinating is trying to imagine how they lived, that the way that they lived, like we live in darkness. We are all flying blind. There's things that God is working on that we can't even imagine. But in the time when there was prophecy, and in the time when these generations were so close to God and understood, they were living in one context, but they already knew like how it was going to play out. Imagine what life would feel like. That for me is like a little window of how I think it will be in Geula, in redemption, when we will understand spiritually and intellectually why things played out the way they did. Looking at it, if you have no information and you're Joseph and you're in prison for eight, I think it was 8 years. You're just, languishing in prison for 8 years and you have no idea where this is going to go. You don't know you're going to be taken out. You don't know you're going to be, cleaned up and brought in front of Pyro, and you're going to be on this, this trajectory, and you don't know how all this is going to happen. It's very hard. That's the way we live right now because we do live in spiritual darkness, but that's how we experience life. But if we understand the biblical roots and the biblical stories that we're going over, we understand that it only looks that way to us. Do you know? It's not the full reality, that God has a whole thing planned out, and we have to be patient and watch it play out. But I find it very comforting and strengthening to know that there is a plan, there is a planner, there is a creator and a sustainer of the universe who's got this, even if I don't understand it, even if it's painful for me, I can't see it, just seems dark and so forth. Okay, let's go back to Natalie, whose dog is in exile. Okay.
With my now the other thing was also about when Jacob arrived in Egypt, because of what he was carrying, the famine stopped. The famine should have been a long time, and the famine stopped. Is what I heard. I can't remember where I've learned that. Have you have heard about that?
I have no, but it wouldn't surprise me, and I'll tell you why. There is a tradition that when tzaddik, when a holy person leaves an area, that or enters, let's say enters an area, that they bring with them blessing just by
Mhm.
them physically being there. And that's
Exactly.
one of the reasons why when Yaakov was with Lavan, why Lavan's fortunes turned around, right? He started having sons. Before that, he only had daughters. He started his fields were fertile and his animals were producing and
Mhm.
so forth. So
Mhm.
Yaakov had a blessing. So it makes sense to me. I don't know. I've never heard it, or I can't name a source for it, but it totally makes sense that he blessed the land of
Mhm.
Israel for the 17 years that he lived there. That totally
Mhm.
is consistent.
That's it. So this is to put also in the context of now, that there is things who are very hard. But now, when I was reading that, it was like, okay, now obviously we don't have the stature. I'm not saying that, but like when you are speaking about these two lady, because of the righteousness of Sarah and Rachel, things have changed for the people, that God has listened to their prayers. And I was like, my gosh, we can still, even in the time is hard, we can still and maybe see the Geula coming earlier than later, again, because of how we are and how we are acting and how we can act. and that we can ask things to God. I'm not saying at their level, but like sometimes we can see more blessing. We don't know sometimes the worth of who we are. And when we learn more of the worth of who we are, we can be, again, like this, listening to also Rabbi Daniel Katz, is like we can be more a kli, a vessel who has more light. And if there is more light, we are giving light to more people. Do you understand what I mean?
I do, and it's especially relevant to us as women because, of course, there is this tradition, you might have heard this, that redemption comes in the merit of the righteous women.
Mhm.
And so even though on one level, on one level, it looks like women are not as powerful as men. On the spiritual reality is exactly the opposite. And it is the women, when we get to the book of Shemot, we get to the book of Exodus and all that, I will talk much more about this in detail, but it was really the merit of the righteous women of that exile, and it will be again the righteous women of
Mhm.
this exile. And a thought popped into my mind as you were speaking that I um ah so it's this idea of there's like how we perceive things when we are just like looking with our fleshy eyes and like regular life, and how things actually are on a spiritual level. So I was thinking of this in terms of actually Teresa's visit, her first visit to Israel, and all the things. So she sometimes texts me and tells me, or she posts on Facebook, whatever, the things that she's experiencing. And so I've been living here for almost 15 years, right? And I remember when we used to come as visitors, or even in the very beginning, like in our first year, everything was popping all over the place. Like, oh my God, this is so incredible, right? But then, this is just life, right? So now I have to worry about getting the car registered, and I have a medical appointment, and I have to, I have to put gas in the car, whatever the like day-to-day things are. They both exist at the same time. And when you go through life, you can go through life that all you see is sort of the mundane level of life. But um, when you go through life as a spiritual person, as a person who is connected to God, then you can see beyond that. So yes, it's true. You still have to, your house is leaking and you have to figure out, to hire a roofer. I'm making up just, things. But we all have the opportunity to plug into the more spiritual channel, to use our spiritual eyes instead of our flesh eyes, to see God's presence in our lives, to see God's presence in the land wherever we're living, if we're lucky enough to be here, and so forth. So I just want to encourage you to use that gift, because as spiritual women who are connected to God, we have that gift.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, we are um I think we're out of time. Is there anybody who has anything like really burning last minute that you want to say before we close out for today? Okay, Andrea just asked, is this true in the merit of non-Jewish women also? So I'm going to tell you, I've never heard one way or another rabbi speak about this, but I will tell you from my experience, I believe absolutely so, because I believe that women like you are part of the redemption, part of the process, and that what you bring to the table, especially those of you who came to be interested in Torah, came to love the land of Israel, whatever your story is, through hardship, I think that is very, very precious to God. And I can't imagine a world in which that didn't count, that didn't help
Mhm.
move redemption forward. And even just that you come here tonight, well, for me it's night, but that you come here today as part of your day and join in learning Torah from the land of Israel is just, how could that not move
Mhm.
God? And how could he not love and appreciate that about your contribution to this process? So on
Wow.
behalf of God, I would like to thank you. Okay, guys, have a great week. I'll see you next week, God willing.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.